So Chikamatsu Monogatari was the third film that Mizoguchi released in 1954. And looking back from this period, it's rather amazing to think that a major filmmaker could release 3 films in 1 year. But it reminds us, I guess, that Mizoguchi was working still within a studio system where all kinds of projects were being developed all the time, and they were being pushed in the direction of particular filmmakers within the company. And pretty much everybody involved in the making of the film was under contract to the company and therefore working full-time, perhaps not only on the one project. So this was a film that came down the pike to Mizoguchi, and according to his regular writer, Yoda Yoshikata, who, as we've mentioned in other introductions in this series, has published a memoir of his years working with Mizoguchi. According to him, Mizoguchi approached this particular project in a slightly distracted or even perfunctory way. It was not something that he had great enthusiasm for. So the first script, the first adaptation of the play was done by Kawaguchi Matsutaro, whom I think we've noted before was a classmate in primary school of Mizoguchi's. And Kawaguchi produced a apparently rather academic adaptation, which Mizoguchi looked at and reported was very craftsmanlike as an adaptation, but contained nothing at all that made him want to make the film. At that point, Kawaguchi, by this time an executive at Daiei, of course, where Mizoguchi was working, passed on it and handed over the challenge of adapting this thing to 2 other writers. One is Yoda Yoshikata, Mizoguchi's regular writer since the 40s and the author of an extremely illuminating memoir about his years of working with Mizoguchi. And the other was the film's planning producer, Mr. Tsuji Hisakazu. Planning is a rather odd credit that appears on Japanese films, particularly in this period of the late studio system. Doesn't really have a Western equivalent. Planning, I think, is somewhere between production management, as the West would understand it, and creative supervisor, in the sense that he has some input into what goes on creatively in the film as well. Let's turn to the title of the film, Chikamatsu Monogatari. It translates literally as a tale from Chikamatsu, or a story from Chikamatsu. And the reference in Chikamatsu is to the great dramatist Chikamatsu Monzaemon. Chikamatsu has no enormous reputation outside Japan, which is why I think the film has had other titles over the years. It's probably best known in the United States as The Crucified Lovers. And that title was, I think, also used a little bit in Britain. However, maybe times have changed. It's being released here on this DVD under the title Chikamatsu Monogatari, and maybe we just need to say briefly, who was Chikamatsu? He was a dramatist of the mid-17th to early 18th century. He was born around 1650, died in 1725, and this particular play was written about 10 years before his death. He's an important figure in Japanese drama and indeed in Japanese literature, a revered figure in many ways, largely because he was the first person working in writing for the theatre who added a literary dimension and various thoughts about structure and dramatic shape, dramatic impact to his writing. He started out as one more anonymous member of a theatre company producing scripts without credit, I mean, part of a team essentially. But he became exasperated or infuriated by the capacity of the actors in kabuki troupes to basically make it up, or to feel free to change it and to do what they liked essentially, or to embellish their roles, or to improvise, to give vent to their own egos on the stage. And so he abandoned the kabuki theatre and began writing for the bunraku puppet theatre. Puppets have the major advantage that they don't improvise, that they basically follow the script, and he liked that. So he was able to work with the man who normally performs the soundtrack, as it were, of a bunraku puppet play known as the joruri. He worked with a certain number of regular joruri, and they followed his scripts. They basically performed what he wrote, which he liked. However, the enormous popularity of much of his bunraku repertoire led to it being further adapted at a later stage back to the kabuki theatre, where, of course, all kinds of depredations happened. This script for this film was based pretty closely on the original bunraku script. However, in the course of rewriting, especially when the second writers, Mr. Yoda and Mr. Tsuji, came on board, they referred, partly at Mizoguchi's suggestion, back to an earlier version of the same story. The writer Ihara Saikaku, whose work, an Osaka writer, whose work Mizoguchi had previously adapted in Saikaku Ichidai Onna, or The Life of Oharu, had dealt with the story of Mohei and Osan, the central couple in this story, in something he had written around the time that Chikamatsu was born, in the mid-17th century. And Mizoguchi had, in fact, at one stage thought of adapting the book in which that story appears as one of his first post-war projects. He wasn't able to do so at the time, but maybe that is one of the ideas that was hanging around in the back of his head. Anyway, he led the writers to the idea of incorporating some ideas from Saikaku's version, slightly earlier than the play, and they did, and the finished film, it does indeed embody both a fairly close adaptation of the bunraku play and certain ideas and motifs that came from the earlier version written by Saikaku, where some of the character names are a little different. Of course, quite a bit of the play is omitted. There's an entire subplot about an uncle is reduced to one scene, for example, and there are quite a lot of other minor variations, but these are of academic interest, I guess, and if you really want to know about them, it's not very hard to find translations of the play, or at least summaries of the play in kabuki handbooks, and you can compare and contrast. So why was Mizoguchi less committed to this film than some of the ones he'd made in the last couple of years for Daiei? I think we can only speculate. There is no credible psychological profile of Mizoguchi that explains this in a believable way. But I think there were clearly two factors. One was the break with Tanaka Kinuyo, his favorite actress, and somebody whom I think it's widely accepted he was in love with in some sense. They had made his previous film together, Uwasa no Onna, or The Woman in the Rumour, which was released incidentally only 5 months before Chikamatsu in Japanese theatres. So it gives you some idea of the speed of the turnaround of this project within Daiei. They had broken up after the shooting, The Woman in the Rumour, because Mizoguchi had stepped in, as we noted in that introduction, to stop her being chosen as the director of a film in her own right. She had directed before, and Mizoguchi, for reasons that have never been explained, stepped in to try and stop her being assigned another directorial job. She never forgave him, and they never worked together again. Whatever his motives were for trying to intervene at the Directors Guild of Japan, he was clearly devastated by the break, and I think never fully recovered, actually, or at least didn't recover until arguably his final film, Street of Shame. That was undoubtedly, I think, one factor psychologically that made him somewhat below par at the time that he made Chikamatsu. The other factor, I think, was the fact that he had won 3 Venice prizes by this time. They weren't the top prizes in any case, but 3 Silver Lions at Venice was quite an impressive haul. And I think, given that he was motivated by his sense of resentment that the relative upstart Kurosawa had started this ball rolling by winning the first major prize at a European festival for a Japanese film, he may have felt that having now won 3 himself, he'd proved his point and that he could rest on his laurels to some degree. So that impetus to compete with Kurosawa undoubtedly had subsided by this stage at the end of 1954. So I'm suspecting that those are 2 factors that conspired to make Mizoguchi feel a little less impassioned, a little less engaged, and a little less totally committed to the project than he had been to some of the others he had made in preceding 2 years. Whatever, if you look at the result, Chikamatsu Monogatari, I think you can see that this film does not have the kind of intensity, the kind of emotional impact, the kind of the sense of a totally engaged emotional commitment that you can find in a film like Ugetsu or a film like Sanshou. This is more a case of kind of going through the motions. And as we said, it may be a source of regret in a way that this seems like a rather academic approach to Chikamatsu and not a very dynamic or engaged approach. There are a number of other factors that may have conspired to inhibit Mizoguchi's total commitment in this film. One of them is the casting, particularly of the central character Mohei, the man, the put-upon clerk who suffer so much in this story. Mohei was played by Hasegawa Kazuo, who was a Daiei contract actor, and who was already, I think at the time that the film was made, was about 46 years old, which is of course significantly too old, I think, for the young romantic lead that the plot essentially requires. However, this was far from the only time that he was cast as a younger man than he actually was by Daiei. In fact, a few years later, let me see, 9 years later, for Ichikawa, in another Daiei film, he plays two roles, an actor and a thief, in a film called An Actor's Revenge, a rather well-known film in the West. And that, what's perhaps less well known in the West, is that those two roles, the double role in that movie, was a recapitulation of two roles he had already played in 1935, in other words, nearly 30 years earlier, for Kinugasa in an earlier adaptation of the same story. Mizoguchi didn't get on with Hasegawa Kazuo, and Yoda in his memoirs reports that they fought repeatedly on the set of this film, which must have slowed down the 28 days. Perhaps it would have been 24 days without these arguments on the set. So Mizoguchi was not very happy to be landed with Hasegawa, whom he thought was a kind of egotistical actor who didn't follow orders, didn't follow instructions from the director, and who had his own kind of ego to assert, and his own ideas about how he thought he should be doing things on screen. Osan was, of course, he took up the casting of Miss Kagawa from Sanshou, his own discovery from Sanshou, and so he was much happier with her. He would also have been happier with the return of his regular art director, Mizutani Hiroshi. They had had a bust-up over Life of Oharu a few years earlier, partly because of the extremely difficult production circumstances of that film. If you may know, you may not know, it was shot not in a real studio, but in a railway shed, in effect, and constantly disrupted by the sound of passing trains. So it was a very fraught shoot, and Mizutani, partly because of those circumstances and partly because of Mizoguchi's unreasonable demands, had left the team, as it were, had walked off. This film marked their reconciliation, and Mizutani worked with Mizoguchi again, and that would have, I think, cheered up Mizoguchi, but it didn't make the film any more engaged than it would otherwise have been. Daiei was perfectly happy with this, as a company would be with a film that, came in on time, on schedule, on budget, and provided in their view, credible roles for leading stars, and they sent the film to the 1955 Cannes Film Festival. It didn't win a prize there.